instructions from my Earl, the boss, was that I could drive taxi Saturday night. So Saturday night I pulled the car that went home, changed my clothes, got ready to drive taxi. So I got in the car at the backyard and brought it out the front. There was 3 Norwegians, and they wanted to taxi to Gravenhurst. There was no cars around then. So I brought the car around and put the 3 Norwegians in and the 3 or 4 musicians. And Dorothy Jarvis, the dispatcher, was a grad scout, and she said, "Oh, Mr. Roseburn wants you to deliver another cord of wood down to Dick Dorn." And I said, "You tell Mr. Roseburn I delivered all the wood I'm going to today." And away I went. But I got down to Gravenhurst and I went into the airport first. And then I went to Gravenhurst, and the police pulled me over, and he said, break him up the car. He said, "Is this Mr. Roseburn's car?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And he says, "Give me the keys." So I gave him the keys. He said, "Go and call your boss." So I called my boss, and he tore about 4 strips off me. I said, "Well, as far as I'm concerned, I'm through. Got my license and never looked back."
Wow.
Orville operated about 2 years by himself. And then in about 2 years, his dad, Harold Hammond, joined him in the taxi business. Harold kept the cars going on the road, and they were a great pair. I think to celebrate 75 years in business, which is no mean feat itself, Orville would have been talking about the people who worked for him and not himself. Orville was a very humble person and knew that it was other people that contributed a great deal to his success. Can't talk about Orville without talking about Fran, his wife. Fran helped him in many, many ways. In fact, many people believe it had to have been for Fran, perhaps Orville may not have been as successful as he was, but he was very proud of Fran and believed that she contributed a lot.
And so Orville and George Parlett started with their Pearly Gates taxi, Park Taxi it was called, the nickname Pearly Gates, because you're as likely to get to the Pearly Gates as wherever you wanted to go when you rode with them. But they had started Park Taxi. Horace Parlett was away at war, so Orville was 14, George was 15. And then Orville's dad was afraid that they would get themselves into trouble, so my dad left his partnership with George and started out on his own with Hammond Taxi. And a year after that, his own dad quit his job and went to work for Orville. So it was always Orville's business, but everybody in the family worked for it. I did my first coach trip 45 years and 6 months ago. I was still in high school, and I was driving a little bus to and from school while I was in school, and I came down to the shop one day. Orville and I were the only ones there, and a call came in from Travelways Maple Leaf, and they had a bus broken down in Algonquin Park. And Orville says, "Well, you better tell your mother that I'm going to be late. I won't make it home tonight." I said, "Oh, well, I've done nothing all day. You go home, I'll take the bus." And he said, "Can you do that?" And I said, "Well, I've driven them thousands of miles backwards, so I should be able to take one forward." So I drove up in Algonquin Park, transferred all the kids that were going on to their end of the year school trip onto my bus, and we drove through to Algonquin Park, got to Ottawa, dropped them off, turned around, came home. Partway through the night, about 2:30 or 3 in the morning, I stopped for a sleep, and I got back into Bracebridge about 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning. And I got home and I was going to go to bed, and Orville said, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm going to bed." He said, you've got school in half an hour." And that's the way he did it, so, you know, he worked his way, so.
business grew quite quickly from the 50s to the 70s. We added the ambulance business, our delivery trucks grew. Of course, the busing was growing all the time. We added a flexible coach. And at age 12, I started dispatch. By 16, I was 15, I was driving a bit. Got into driving coach, I think, in about 1961 or something. Hammond Transportation always had a cartage business. And we all worked at it, whether it was drawing wood or delivering freight. And 1971, I bought out the cartage business and formed Muskoka Transport. With Orv's help, financing, and we started Muskoka Transport at that time.
Orville had discovered that after he had sold the trucks to his younger brother Paul, Muskoka Transport, that suddenly he had two sons that were old enough to be working, but we weren't old enough to drive school bus because we weren't 21 yet.
Right.
So he bought two small trucking companies in Huntsville, and Jim quit college and I quit high school, and we went to work.
The problem is I didn't, when I was in college, I should have played more and worked less, but I would come home every weekend and work, and you get used to the paycheck.
Well, I think the big thing, it was instilled in us to work. I can remember lots of times that we would be there 10 minutes early, whether we were picking up people in a taxi, and the busing was the same thing. Way back when I drove a 4104 in 1956, like we always had to be there with the bus clean and 10 or 15 minutes early. And that's, I think, what's built Hammond Transportation to what it is today.
Our Hammond family, that's what we grew up with, that you went to work, whatever needed to be done, that's what you did today. It didn't matter. I was lucky I got involved in the business after the days of the ambulances and trucking, but I think my back really appreciates that I wasn't carrying freight and meat a whole lot, but I did have a taste of that business too. So our motto really has been that you step in and you do whatever needs to be done.
As I was growing up, many memories of on Woodchester Avenue, pumping up the old gas pump. You had to pump 10 gallons up to the glass area to fill up the cars, and memories of riding with Orv to Fraserburg, Purbrook in the school bus as he delivered the children home. The Fraserburg Purbrook Road at that time was just a rut road, gravel road full of ruts, and so in the springtime especially, you'd have to go very quickly to try and get through a lot of soft spots. Even when I didn't live in Bracebridge, sometimes there were times that a bus or a truck would show up in my driveway in Sunbridge, and they would say, "Can you drive it too?" And so I often had those little assignments to do as well.
No, it was hard work when we were young guys. We delivered freight and meat and furniture and all that kind of stuff. And so that's why the bus, when you didn't have to carry stuff, the busing business seemed a lot better.
Yeah, we had these newspaper runs, and when I was in high school, the fellow that did the run was an old buddy of Dad's, and it went up through Huntsville to almost to Algonquin Park and back through Dorset, Baysville, and he didn't like driving in the wintertime, so if it was a really rotten, snowy day, there'd be an announcement, "Greg Hammond, please come to the office," and I'd show up at the office and have to call my dad, and he'd say, "I need you to do that newspaper run today." So when the weather was really bad, I 16-year-old Greg got to drive the newspapers.
We lived next to the business till I was 14 or 15 years old, and my mom said that when I was about 3, I used to disappear in the mornings. And she would just call next door and they'd say, oh, I'd be gone. I'd be away on a taxi trip with one of the drivers. And I'd be back in 20 minutes.
He would show up at school with a brown paper bag with a pair of pajamas and a toothbrush in it. He'd pick up Jim and I or Greg or whoever when we were still in school. He'd leave a message with the principal of the school to call my mom and tell her we weren't going to be home, you know.
And even as, you know, when we were older too, I can remember he and I coming home from looking at a bus in Montreal and stopping and sleeping in the main street of Barry's Bay because we couldn't make that last 100 miles.
Oh, and even into his 70s, he would take a bus on Sunday and go up to the Pines and take people from the Pines out for a drive, and they'd get out to Baysville and they'd stop and he'd buy them all ice cream.
You never knew you were going to wind up with him, you know. He'd have a line on a used vehicle or something, you know, and he'd grab a couple of old guys and away you'd go, and you'd get the cheapest hotel room or you'd sleep in the car or whatever, but he'd just show up at school and pick you up and away you'd go. You'd be gone for days.
I know Dad was very proud, and when we bought into the business in 1987, I believe it was, we bought some shares from Dad, and he formed his own company called Bracebridge Bus Lines at that time, and he always said, well, I want to have this company just in case you boys fire me.
I could write a book about Ivan Beasley. Good guy, good guy. Whether he was dispatching or driving taxi, or some of my fondest memories was in the ambulance business with Bees. He was always cool, calm, collective, no matter whether you were doing 50 mile an hour or 90 mile an hour. He just sat there and drove.
Ivan was great. He truly was. When I started working, he said to me one time, if you're going to work here in the office, the first thing you've got to do is learn how to sign your old man's name. Ivan had a very good Orville Hammond signature and taught me how to sign Orville Hammond. I got called to the bank because they were concerned about somebody forging checks on our account. So I went to the bank and they had 5 checks lined up on the counter, and they wanted me to verify my dad's signature. So 5 of the checks, of the 5 checks, 4 of them were Orville K. Hammond signatures that I had signed, and the 5th check was the check that he had written on the side of a bus, and they were concerned that that was the forgery.
Another time, a fellow told me this story. Orville was on a school run, and the motor was in the back of the flexible, and the back seat was a full seat, would tip ahead. The linkage fell off the carburetor, and he couldn't get it to stay on. So he lined the kids up in the school bus right to the back, and he picked a guy by the name of Buck Ingalls to sit back there with the carburetor and give it gas right at the carburetor. So Orville would say to the girl behind him, tell Buck to give it a little more fuel. So she'd tell the next one, the next one, the next one. You got the school run done. That's how you had to work in those days. I mean, safety was always there, but sometimes you had to do what you had to do to get the things done.
Great camaraderie, like when we were bus drivers or truck drivers. It was a lot of fun.
There's the fun of driving, then there's the fraternity with the other drivers when you get where you're going, and then there's the drive home. And I've had a lot of 3 a.m. mornings driving home that I just feel like I'm 18.
The story of the Hammond family and Hammond Transportation isn't just a story of a family business with one family. We have lots of husband and wife teams that work for us. We have couples that met when they were working for us. So a long-time employees and multi-generational employees. So it's really, their family has become a part of the Hammond Transportation family, and that family business story is their story too.
Orville was more of a friend than a boss.
All of our employees we try to treat them as family and treat them the way that we would like to be treated. And we're really fortunate. I've got my cousins, Scott Hammond is our Director of Operations, and Derek Hammond is head of our shop and maintenance. And it's just a really neat experience and unique experience in 2019 that you could work with so many family members in a business that is located in such a beautiful part of the world. So we're pretty fortunate.
Orville was a very honest person. When you're dealing with Orville, you did not need it in writing. A handshake is all you needed. And he was just so proud of what the Hammond name stood for.